welcome to 2024. For those of you who are new, we have a list of guests that may or may not have made it, but welcome, and we'll get the meeting started here. We've received 4 notifications of new members, and for those of you, if we have you online, welcome. And if we don't, we're going to beat you up and wonder why. These are some of the notes. The meeting list has been finalized, and that's in the on the website. Each meeting has a specific topic. There are 5 evaluations this year rather than 6. And each of those is noted in the listing. You should also note that we had a discussion at the board level about the banquet. We heard some feedback that from some folks that they thought it was more expensive than usual. And it probably was because in a previous year, the dues supplemented the cost. And last year they did not, but the banquet was a very nice event. And for some it was pricey, and we'll look at that a little bit more and see if whether we can trim down on some of the hors d'oeuvres or something else to make it be a little less expensive for those who were concerned about that. But it's certainly a nice venue. It's a nice place. It has the electronics to make it be good. The next meeting is as listed here on Tuesday, February 13th. It is an evaluation meeting with Mary Fisk Taylor, and it's an open evaluation. There is no assigned subject on that. So get your photographs in a timely way, and we'll look forward to that. Certainly, we wanted to thank Linda for being secretary, and welcome Jerry. And as we go down this list, the big one, please pay your dues. The Camera Club is on a calendar year basis, so everyone's dues, with the exception of those who have some gratis that was given for some other reason. But for other folks, the dues are due, and we would ask that you come forward with those. We've left the dues amount the same as last year. We're not experiencing inflation here yet, although it might come one day, but please get your dues payment in. Joe Ring and others have put a long list of events that are available. I didn't want to put every one of them, but on the in the newsletter, there's a calendar, and it's full of about 20 events, it looks like. Things that you can participate in and things that are online, and just be aware of that. And again, it's in the newsletter and it's listed nicely. I would remind you, for those who don't know, if the event is an Eventbrite one that is sponsored by another person, then you may have to do 2 steps, not only enroll online, but enroll on the Eventbrite site as well. So it's a 2-step process. Some people have voiced a frustration about that. I spoke to those folks at Link, and they're working on trying to make that be more seamless. But at least at this time, if you say you're coming, you still have to enroll in their site as well. So just be aware. Karen, do you want to say something about the survey?
Oh, I was going to let you take the accolades there for assigned subjects, but I mentioned earlier when we were chatting that we did a survey of the members and got quite a great response with over 80 suggestions for assigned subjects. So a little drum roll, please. Our winners for 2024 are tree or trees, And I think we have Michael Bryant to thank for that suggestion. Panoramas, I think that was a suggestion from our webmaster, Terry Troxel. And then doors and or windows. Not sure, that might have come from Dan Maurer. But those are the three for this year. We don't know exactly which month we're assigning those, but we'll let you know within the next couple of weeks. And then the runners up, we thought we would just kind of keep those in our pocket for 2025. So those were the 4 runners up.
So those are great subjects, and I'm sure that you can find in your library or go out and produce some great winning images for those categories. And again, welcome to Pat. With our thanks to Michael Orr, but Pat has now got the ball again, and Pat is featured in the newsletter, so you can find where she's been and what she's done in the software world. And we'd like to also thank the end of the year winners, with Anita having placed that list in Facebook. With the, I'm hoping the associated images can be also put either on a YouTube or a listing. We now know the names of the images. We've seen the images. We hope to be able to match those together.
Martin, the winners are up on the web. People can see everything there.
Good, good. And for Dan, the multiple exhibits are coming in 24. That again is also in the newsletter. You can find that information there. The feature for tonight, obviously, is Jeffrey Alison. And because I'm new in this role and I did not know Jeffrey before this evening, I did a Google search, and you'll be interested. This is Jeffrey Allen. He plays linebacker for the New York Jets. And I figured out in a hurry that this was not the right one. And there are a lot of Jeffrey Allisons around. There's a baseball player and so forth, but I did find the right one, and he's here with us this evening. You can read what I've written. He has multiple degrees. He is has been a consultant and advisor to TV, digital, and print media. He teaches advanced photography at VMFA, director of the statewide exhibits, and he's a photographer himself. So the last one in our eyes counts probably more than all the other ones, but certainly we're privileged to have him here. I think the images that he's responsible for in the role of statewide exhibitions is really profound. The truck, or the, however you want to call that, big 18-wheeler that travels around, is really a wonderful benefit for the state. It's like a bookmobile, except it's not books, it's images, and that's wonderful because everybody can't come to the library all the time, and this can make a big difference for a lot of folks. So it's our privilege to welcome Jeffrey and take it over.
It's wonderful to be here tonight in person. And I want to thank everyone who's come out here, and I especially want to thank everyone that's watching on Zoom. It's really a thrill to be asked to speak here tonight. And we're going to talk about a couple of women who I think are incredibly important in the history of photography and who still have a lot of relevance today. But before we do that, next October seems like a long time away, doesn't it? But it's not, so start planning now. We have the convergence again at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts of having 2 major photography exhibitions at the same time. If you remember a couple of years ago, we had Ansel Adams and Man Ray open almost at the exact same day. So we were photo. And I was fortunate to work on both of those exhibitions. I'm also working on the next 2. Some of you may have heard Sarah Kennel, our photography curator, talk about the long arc, Southern photography. And that's 188 photographs. So that's a big show. It starts 1845 and goes all the way into basically now. And if you think of well-known Southern photographers, whether it's someone like our very own Sally Mann here in Virginia, Emmett Gowan, also Richmond from Virginia, William Eggleston, William Kristen Berry, and a lot of other names from history and again, contemporary photographers today. And then American Born Hungry, which is curated by Alison, our executive director. And I've been fortunate to work with him on this show for 6 years. That's a long time, even in a museum. And it's the largest exhibition of photography ever put together, focusing on those photographers who you may well know their names, who worked in America, but were originally from Hungary. And we're thinking about André Cortège. We're thinking about the film director, Michael Cortège. A lot of folks that you'll go, oh, I had no idea Robert Capa was Hungarian. And so their stories and their influences on fashion, on documentary and journalistic photography and other things, it is just amazing, as well as what they did with art and with helping to found the Art Institute of Chicago, things like that. And again, that's going to be a huge show because I think we now own an example of every photograph ever made by Hungarian American photographers. So tune into that. So as you can see, I want to focus on Imogen Cunningham and Dorothea Lange. And how many people are familiar with Imogen Cunningham? Okay, a couple, but not all, but okay. And I think most people certainly know Dorothea Lange, right? The great photographer, best known for her work during the Great Depression. And what's fun is the influence that Imogen had on Dorothea and on the influence that Imogen had on women coming into photography in the 60s and 70s. One more. As you can see, Imogen Cunningham, 1883 to 1976. And another reason I chose her is I knew her as a very young lad. And one of the great stories about Imogen Cunningham is that she loved cats and she collected cats her entire life. And in the early 70s, I went out to the East Coast. I was very naive on the West Coast. I was very naive. And my mission was to meet Ansel Adams. And I did. And he said, oh my God, have you had anything for dinner? And I said, no. And he took me in. This is a true story. And I got to spend a lot of time with Edward Weston Sons, with a lot of other folks, and went to San Francisco. And they gave me her phone number. And I said, I'm Jeffrey Alison, and I'm a young photographer from the East Coast. They said, the East Coast? You came all the way from the East Coast, the Atlantic Ocean? And I finally got done talking to all of these people, trying to explain that while I was on the East Coast, I did not live on the coast like they did at Carmel or at San Francisco. And oh, it's so exciting. And I said, and I brought you a hat. And she said, come on over. Hi. Well, the long story you may not have heard simply is that I got to meet and spend time with Imogen Cunningham, and she was delightful, and that she was surrounded with young men, even in, the last couple of years before she passed away. I want to shout out truly the first American woman photographer who made her job as a full-time photographer and became very famous, and who may be lesser known, and that is Frances Benjamin Johnston. And she was born in Washington, D.C. to wealthy parents, but she ended up having a long, very successful career as a professional, and she was a one of a kind. The photograph you see, that's her. It's a self-portrait. And in addition, from 1864 to 1952, she went out there and she said, I am going to go into a men's world. In 1864, men were photographers, professionals, and got paid for it. There were women who were making photographs, but not many who were professionals. And she had an illustrious career. She photographed the U.S. government. She photographed a lot of commercial work. She did a lot of portraits of her and her friends like this, breaking all of the stereotypes. And Booker T. Washington hired her for a remarkable commission. This is an image from what was then Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. And he hired her to do an in-depth study, photographs, everything that went on there that were then displayed at the 1901 Paris exhibition. And it was representing that college and colleges like that and the work they were doing. As well as Hampton was a Native American school. And one of the few ones that actually even today has a decent reputation, not like a lot of the native schools in Canada, for example. So, but fascinating woman if you're not really familiar with her. Okay, Imogen Cunningham, first photograph that she ever made was a self-portrait nude in 1906. So she's already getting ahead of the curve as well, isn't she? And that's her self-portrait number 2 in 19. And when she was 18, she mailed away and got her first camera. And the important thing to think about her is that she knew from the get-go that she wanted to be a photographer. So she enrolled in college in chemistry. And when she enrolled, both chemistry and photography were pretty much an all-male dominated world. But she said, if you want to be a photographer, especially before digital, you had to know a lot about chemistry, right? It was a wonderful hat from the 1930s that had faux jewels on it with a little feather that stuck up like that, that I found in a secondhand store, to be honest. And anyway, there she is. That's Cunningham Hall at the University of Washington in Seattle. And there's another self-portrait from 1910. And one of the things about her is she initially became very involved with a dance troupe and made a lot of photographs of the dancers up in the mountains outside of Seattle, Washington. And then eventually, next slide, please. There we go. She started making a lot of photographs, portraits. Now, remember, these are soft focus. This is 1910, 12, etc. We're talking pictorialism, right? And in those years, pictorialism was all about doing everything you could to make a photograph look like a painting. The only way to make photography serious and to maybe get into a show was if you did everything possible, sometimes putting gum bichromate on top of it and adding watercolors and doing all this manipulation to get away from what photography does really so beautifully. And she was incredibly successful, as you can see. Next slide, please. And here we have pictorialism, and we have some of those images of people out in the forest, and Claire and John. And again, these were all friends of hers. She ultimately becomes friends with a huge number of important artists in all medium, whether they're writers, poets, and certainly photographers and painters. Next slide, please. There we go. And then she gets married. And for a while, she has 3 children fairly close together, as you can see. And so she focuses on her family, and she focuses ultimately on the garden. Next slide, please. There we go. And she starts doing these incredible photographs. As you can see, these are the 20s. She's moving out of pictorialism. She's moving into straight photography. And her photographs are beautiful. They're modernist. They're all about form, but ultimately they're used by people in textbooks about these types of plants and things. So she's contributing, again, to science at the same time that she's making art. And I love the agave. She joins the group F64. And we know the group F64, we think about Ansel Adams, we think about Edward Weston. There were also a number of women, Imogen, Consuelo Canega, and Sonia. And there the 3 of them are out with their view cameras, photographing. Next. And we think Ansel, Edward, Willard Van Dyke, Henry Swift, John Paul Edwards, Brett Weston, who joined because he was old enough as Edward Weston's son, Consuelo, Alma Levinson, Sonia, and Preston Holder. There's a wonderful photograph by Imogen Cunningham of Ansel in 1975, which was about the same time period I met her and Ansel. And of course, there's his Moonrise over Half Dome from 1960 and Half Dome Apple Orchard from 1933. Very consistent photographer. One of the fun things about working, because I had met him, I came back to Virginia and ultimately curated 2 exhibitions of his work. And one of the fun things is looking at prints he made in the 1930s and then looking at a print made in the 1970s or early 80s of the same negative and how he changed how he printed them over the years. And they become much more contrasty. The tonalities change a lot. And, you know, I always talk about how we have changed how we see photography. We see how we see visual. In 1919, people looked at natural light. You know, by the 1920s, 30s, you're looking at light coming off a screen that's projected in a movie theater. Then you go to TV. Now we're sitting in front of a computer. Each of those steps has made us see things in a more contrasty fashion. So when we look at a lot of old photographs, we think those are flat. Well, they're not. In terms of the zone system, they're actually correct. Could I have the next slide, please? These are two photographs of a series that she made of a young, believe it or not, Edward Weston with McGreath Mather. McGreath Mather was the first person to really take Edward Weston seriously as an artist. And she had a gallery, and she was showing his work as art photography. And of course, they had to have an incredible affair because that's what he did. And I just think they're so fun and they're so different. And if we look through, there's a series of 6 or 8 of these you can find online, very dramatic. And he had the Hitler mustache, which he saved off when the war broke out, of course. Next slide, please. These are 2 photographs she made later on. And that's at Point Lobos. And that day, she, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, and Charis, his then wife and model, were all out there on the same day. So I think it's just fun to see that. And it reminds me that, like me, Edward Weston was really short. So next slide, please. She also ended up photographing a lot of really famous artists, and Frida Kahlo is a great example of that, as well as Alfred Stieglitz. And that painting behind him is by his wife. So I think that's interesting as well, Georgia O'Keeffe. And that's really one of the more sensitive photographs ever made, particularly of Frida Kahlo. And Imogen was really well known for really going beyond the surface and really capturing part of the soul, which is what we try to do, I think, with portraits. Next slide, please. She really, as I said, got into modernism here with shredded wheat tower, water tower, Man Ray version of Man Ray. So that's multiple images of Man Ray, right? Which just plays right into, I think, him. And then the Cornish School Trio, 1935. And then next slide. She also photographed a lot of nudes. And again, but they're sculptural. They're modernist. They're about form. They go back to sort of what Edward Weston was talking about in terms of finding that essential form in all things being equivalent. Next slide. Then post-war, the kids grow up, and she's out and she travels to Virginia, New York. She's all over the place. Here's Double Dutch. She's shooting street photography. Imagine out there shooting street photography when you started out with an 8x10 glass plate camera in Seattle in the 19 teens. And one thing I didn't mention is all the photographs she made in Washington State before she came to San Francisco were glass plate negatives. And they were not wealthy people. And have you ever picked up a crate of glass, 8x10 glass in a wooden crate? So she made prints of all of them, and then they shattered the negatives. Those glass negatives don't exist, so, which is just phenomenal. It's a good thing she lived another 80 years, really. Next slide. This is a wonderful, oh my gosh, I was doing so well, my brain. A wonderful dancer and choreographer whose name has just jumped out of my head. And then a very early 70s photograph on the right. And I love that smoke and the air. And she'll come back to me. Next slide. And then she met a young photographer who I also knew when I was in California, Judy Dater. And Judy looked up to her. Judy is still alive, very much incredibly successful photographer. It's an art photographer in many museums, including ours. And I love this book because of the cover photograph, and that's Twinka, the nude model. Twinka was an incredibly successful fashion model. And here's Imogen in her 80s out there with her twin lens reflex camera, which looks huge on her because she's so tiny, making these wonderful photographs of Twinka. And then that's a self-portrait in a storefront in San Francisco. Next slide. And that's the last image I want to show of Imogen's. It's probably her most famous photograph. She's really well known for her images of flowers like that. And there was a time when I could have bought that photograph for $200. And I don't want to tell you what it's worth now. But of course, I didn't have $200 when I was a young boy rambling around. Next slide, please. But this is fun. There is this wonderful group. And here we have Imogen and Dorothea Lange in the same photograph. They actually taught together at the same university for quite a while. And I just think it's cool. And then there's a photograph of the young Dorothea Lange with Paul Taylor, which would become her second husband, in 1939 out on the road. And he wrote a lot of the articles that were combined with her photographs for the Farm Security Administration and Later Life magazine. Next. So there's a photograph of her in 1930. I think, you know, really looking good. There she is in 1958. And there she is. There are a lot of photographs of her on top of her car, photographing with her press view camera. And she is going to have a tremendously different approach than Imogen did, even though she was really influenced by it. Next slide. Her early career, portrait of Joan Lange Bowley, which is her mother from 1927. Again, her mother in 1915 and her brother in 1920. And the interesting thing is that she was born in New York and her father basically just left and never came back. And so she got rid of his name and took on her mother's maiden name, which was Lange, and ultimately ended up in California. And that's where she started meeting Imogen Cunningham and all the other folks. Next. And then she has a portrait studio in San Francisco. She starts out really as a retoucher. They called it a finisher back then, which is a nicer term than retoucher, and ultimately started making photographs on her own. Next. The Haas brothers, which I think is a beautiful, sensitive portrait, don't you? Mrs. Kahn and Child. You have to kind of really look at that one. And then, you know, a standard portrait. The Beer family. Next. And family and friends, there's Roy Partridge and Maynard Dixon and Paul Taylor and his grandson. If you think about Roy Partridge and you think about Maynard Dixon, those are names that pop up if you were to read Edward Weston's day books. And if you want, we have a lot of winter left. We're going to get snowed in at least once. I'm predicting it, and this is on tape. And if you've never read Edward Weston's day books, they're a good read. They've never been out of print. There are two of them, Mexico day books, California day books. And now you can get them in a paperback together. And his day books are basically his diaries. And he writes about all the people he's involved with, both professionally, artistically, and otherwise. Day-to-day life, his thoughts and theories about photography, about what formalism is, what does F-64 group really mean, things like that. And they're a hoot. And when it came time for him to publish those, he was very ill, and he would sit at Carmel, and he took a razor blade, and his original pages, he would cut out part of names and leave like on a letter like M. But then the next page, he would forget to cut the word out. But then he knew a lot of women and people with the name M. So part of the fun over this winter, your homework is reading those. And when you're reading and he says, I met M this morning and woo, all this happened. And you turn the page, you find out it was McGreeth Mather. But then it could have been a list of people. And so Roy Partridge, Maynard Dixon, these writers, these poets, these painters show up in all of these documents a lot and give you a real colorful idea of what the creative scene in California, and particularly LA up through San Francisco might have been. Next slide. There we go. Then the Depression hits, right? And this is where she becomes extraordinarily well known. Breadline, this White Angel breadline is one of her most famous photographs. And this image right here, right? It goes back to Renaissance art in a way, the way she's seeing things. And then the cities in the early 30s, 1934, breadlines, people out of work waiting in line to try to get a day job. Next. And then Family on the Road, 1938, and Migrant Mother, which is why she's on the map, right? one of the most famous photographs in the world, and we can all, because it's part of the Library of Congress, because she made it to the Farm Security Administration. And you can pay to get a relatively inexpensive photograph made, or you can pay to get a higher grade photograph made. And if you want to build a little collection of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, all the photographers that worked for the government, they're originals. They're just not signed and they, not printed by the photographer, but they're pretty nice. That's a timeless photograph, isn't it? It is Renaissance art. It is the Madonna. It is all of those things captured in one. But there's a lot more to this story and about how we as photographers work. Let's go to the next thing. How did she come to make that photograph? She didn't intend to make it. She was driving down the highway in California on the way to an assignment. And generally, they didn't just go wander around and photograph randomly. They would say, okay, at 9 o'clock the next morning, go to this place and photograph this migrant camp or whatever. She's driving along, she sees it, she drives past, she stops about 2 miles down the road, turns around, comes back, and she spends the next hour and a half getting closer and talking and really putting these people at ease, and here, until that final photograph is made. So she's doing all these outtakes. And look at these are 4x5 negatives. This means she's using up her whole day's supply, basically making this important photograph. One more slide. So here's the original 1936. Well, when that photograph came out, she promised those people that would not go into the newspaper. So I don't do newspaper photography. I work for documentary department of federal government. This is just going to go in a file back in Washington, D.C. And the one was out. I said, I don't want a newspaper. We're all paranoid about newspaper photographers, aren't we? People say, hey, you're not new here, put that in newspaper. And it did. It got leaked and it ended up in a newspaper. And she was pretty upset about it. And the newspaper article added insult to injury because it kind of made up the story. They broke down there. They were doing that. They were down to the last cent, and their tires were all flat. And there was who knows if they ever made it out of there, trying to get their way to migrant work. Who knows? Well, the truth was that her husband and oldest son had taken the tire and was walking into town to get it repaired. That changes how you read that whole story, doesn't it? Man, And so a wonderful reporter, after all these years, 1979, tracked this woman and her children down and finally convinced her to talk and tell that whole story and clear up all of the misunderstanding about what really happened. And isn't that fascinating? That's documentary photography. That's documentary photography too. And I love how that can come across the ages and connect that way. Next slide. Keep us on time. World War II at Home, untitled news board, but deeper into life. Shipyard construction workers. What happened? I put that in because it's Richmond, California. But think about it. Look at that guy's hat. That light right there. Isn't that just the most beautiful hat from the 40s? It's like every, Bogart film ever made, I think. So that whole thing switches and people are going back to work, and things are changing. Next slide. What's also happening is Japanese internment, right? And, at the outbreak after the Japanese attack, the Japanese in particularly California were rounded up and put into internment camps. And, early on they were trying to do this thing, I am American. I've been living here for 10 generations. I built your railroads. I've been here. 2 children who with their parents are awaiting evacuation bus. That's text and photographs by Ansel Adams because he was the first person invited to photograph the internment camp. And we'll talk about that. But she owned, that's her copy of his book that she owned. Next. And here we have this whole group of Japanese family that are being taken to the camp. And they're all labeled, this is the family. So one wanders off, it's crazy. Next. And does that mountain look familiar to anybody? Maybe not in this photograph. That is the internment camp. Next. And it's Manzanar. And it is the most famous, not the only one, but it was the war relocation center for the Japanese that were interred there. Next. Ansel Adams photographed there first, and he invited Dorothea Lange to come and then photograph as well. And it was supposed to be propaganda. Everybody was supposed to be happy. You know, we have built, it's like a community center. We have our own newspaper that we're creating, you know, craft center, kitchens, food, and here are these happy people reading the newspaper. That's kind of what it looked like when he went up on that knoll. And he was captivated by that mountain. And he said, I'm going to take a day off and I'm going to go photograph the mountain. Next slide. And that's the photograph that he made, one of the most famous Adams photographs ever done. And when he went basically to the other side of the encampment and kept going and set up his view camera, you know, the rest became history like that. Next. Post-war, here's a son of a Mormon pioneer. Your Halloran's out in the fields in Ireland. She did a lot of work in Ireland. And a lot of it was published. And next. And then two women, Egypt, 1963. Korea, 1958. And here she is. She developed polio as a young child, and it ultimately left her with a pretty severe limp, you know, for the rest of her life. And she ended up having a lot of health problems late in life. But here she is in this wonderful, this is her studio, preparing for her one-woman show, her career retrospective at MoMA. And she didn't make it. She passed away right before the show opens. Isn't that sad? Next. And that's it. So that I think I'm keeping it on time pretty correctly there. And I had this incredible young man who was running the slides there. Thank you so much. The reason I wanted to share these, I mean, had I known it was going to be such a rainy, dreary night, we'd have been looking at color photography, right? But I do think both of these women are just incredibly important. I think Dorothea Lange's lasting importance because of the depression and farm security. You know, she pops up in Ken Burns documentaries, for example. You know, the migrant mother is just an iconic poster child of so many things. But the fact that Imogen, you know, lived another 11 years after Dorothea passed away and was making photographs, contemporary photographs the year she passed, says a lot about her tenacity, her toughness, and her contributions too. So if you've never heard of Judy Dater, if you've never heard of Twinka, the model, who was in a lot of photographs by a lot of people, you know, that's an interesting period in photography history to delve into. And I'll shut up in a minute, but does anyone have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Not saying I can answer it.
You can. The day book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to.
I think you should.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Edward Weston's day books. Yeah. Yeah. And again, the fun thing is about halfway through his life, he became a vegetarian. And you learn about that in the day books too. You learn about Ansel Adams playing piano and Edward Weston dancing. And if anybody come to the Ansel Adams show at the museum a couple years ago, and we focused on it, you know, it was Ansel Adams' composition in nature because he was a serious pianist. He could have been a mediocre concert pianist. And he decided to be a wonderful photographer because he could be a better photographer than a pianist. But he played. And I love the idea of that group of still youngish photographers gathering at Wildcat Hill. Edward Weston's had 4 sons. 3 of them were photographers, and one of them was a carpenter. And the youngest one was the carpenter. And I got to spend a lot of time with him, and he was a hoot. And what he did was build his father a cabin right across the highway from Point Lobos, California, where so many Weston photographs are made. And it's right outside of Carmel, and it's gorgeous. And it's a cabin. I mean, it's rough, you know what I'm saying? But he was happy to have it. And so you know, they would have parties there. You know, Adams and these other guys, or women, would come from Carmel and down and go up to the cabin, and there was a piano, and there are these photographs of Ansel playing, and you can, and people drinking red wine and arguing politics, you know, and all those things that artists were doing. And it just, you know, it's fun. And, you know, it's a hoot. And then I will say, Charis Weston, her his younger wife there, but most important model probably, much, much later on in life, wrote a biography called The Other Side of the Lens. And it was her story about all of that. And so it makes a great combination. You know, a lot of people come away hating Edward Weston because, you know, he's kind of a jerky guy for all the wonderfulness. And so I think it's wonderful to have her balanced reporting on it. So it's fun. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yes.
Yeah, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I'm looking forward to going to the museum in DC and seeing the Dorothea Lange exhibition, which you've given a nice introduction to. My question is there any evidence that maybe Vivian Meyer may have learned anything from the work of Imogen Cunningham or other street photographers?
That's a wonderful question. And there's no real hard evidence that you can point to other than the fact that she would have been very aware of them. And I think they would have had an influence on her indirectly, if not directly. Does that make sense? She's, you know, even though
She was quite a loner, so I mean, it does make perfect sense that would, but you just wonder about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. And
My second,
yeah.
I'm sorry. My
Go
second
ahead.
question is, you said that you teach advanced photography. Is that open to the public? Because I've never seen it in the catalog.
Me? Do I
Yes.
teach advanced photography? I used to do it for 20 years. I did 2 semesters, spring and fall and summer. And the classes were from 7 to 9 on Tuesday night. And that was in addition to everything else I do. And now I do some workshops like a Saturday or Sunday, but not every semester. My job takes me traveling all over the place, and I love to do it. I will say I'm going to do a 2-part photo history class in conjunction with the Long Arc and American Born Hungry shows, and we'll be going up into the galleries and looking at all the photographs, and I'm going to bring in daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, stereographs, and stereo viewer, so you can get sort of hands-on of all the different processes that are involved, particularly in that Southern photography. It'll be in the fall on a fall catalog that we put out, or online for the fall class listings. Yeah, it'll be, well, yeah, because it'll be October. That's, yeah. You know, and you know, I do other things. I just, like I said, for 20 years, I was basically 3 semesters a year. And I just can't do that. Too old. The history program, it has a super minimal fee. I mean, it's not a big charge. And if you're all members, it's even cheaper. And I would recommend that if you dropped your membership because you never came to the museum, or if you have let it lapse, you know, if you go to those 2 exhibitions in October and park in the deck and eat and buy a book in the cafe, I mean, the bookshop, you've more than paid for your membership. You know, I was so thankful. I have to pay to park in the museum. I work there full time. I've been there for 30 years, you know, I still have to pay. But I was so thankful to park in the deck today. You know, when I came out, I could just leisurely get in my car, you know, so it's worth it. Oh, I know, you know, the only way you don't pay is if you're a member, that's covered. or if you're a volunteer. So it's a good way to get some freebies too. And don't forget, we always have that tiny photography gallery on the third floor outside of a Muse restaurant. There's always something exciting going on there. And then lastly, you may or may not have heard about our incredible expansion project that we're undertaking. And that as part of that, for the first time in the history of the museum, we'll have a 5,000 square foot permanent photography gallery to do shows in. And we'll also have open to the public a true print study room. So, you know, you could call up and say, I want to come over and look at Dorothea Lange prints or Edward Weston or whatever. And you can actually sit down and have a beautiful space with the right light to see and everything. Yeah, we're building, this wing is something like 190,000 square feet. And it's fascinating because people worry where we're going to put it, right? And if I'm standing in a sculpture garden, you know, and the red reeds are right here, and there's a door that I can go through, and there's the cafe, it goes to the right of that. And it goes from there all the way down to Grove Avenue. And what's fascinating is it's going to go up. I've learned, especially with inflation and costs to construct things, it is much less expensive to go up than to go down in our ground in Richmond. You know, and I mean, all the HVAC stuff will be down. So the new wing, we're going to move the American art collection into there. We're going to move African collection into there. We're going to have an event space. We're going to have coffee shop, maybe a new restaurant, a lot of other things, a lot of art storage. But what that also allows us to do, then we're going to take the American gallery that we have right now. That part of that will be the print study room. Then there'll be the 5,000 square foot photography gallery. And then I'm also the Mellon educator. I work with the Paul Mellon collection. Right now it's European, but it's separated. It's like a little lost thing over here. So we're going to use European back to where African collection is right now. Knock a hole in the wall. So, you know, our impressionist work, our French impressionists, you can walk through there to get to other European art. So hopefully we'll finally get it so you don't get a dead end in the museum, you know, which I hate when you have to go back through. It's ambitious. It's remarkable. We have a wonderful support from the state, basically matching 2-to-1. And when we built the wing in 2010 that opened, that was a 1-to-1. So even just having that difference in funding makes a huge difference. We are going to have more outside space. We are renovating that space right now. You won't believe it, but you know, we had such great plans for that space, but in the way that things happen, we don't have a lot of electrical outlets up there. And so you think all the things you can do. Yeah, but you know, if you want to have a performance type thing up there, and so, and we're completely changing the landscape. It's going to be much more beautiful, but also much more usable, I think. But we're also expanding the garden. We're gonna have a lot more sculptures out there. We have a lot more sculptures than you can see sitting out there. And there will be outdoor spaces on the new wing. Because that's the hot thing. You have to have yes, you know. So we have to keep up with the core coating. Right. So anyway, yeah, big things coming. It's going to be, you know, come and enjoy the shows now. You know, it's going to get more interesting as we start building the new wing, because having gone through the 2010 wing and watching galleries get closed because you can't have art hanging on a wall when you're bang, 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 building a whole new wing next door. So things will get shuffled around, you know, exciting times to live in. And that's why the Artmobile is so important. We're going to have more art on there. We'll have the Artmobile probably at the museum a lot more, just to showcase works that are no longer on new view. And we're traveling a lot more exhibitions around the state. Thank you all so much for everything. Thanks for being online and putting up with all of our issues, and thanks for being here. We really appreciate it. And hope I get to come back sometime.